Tractate Bechoros covers the various laws of the Firstborn Tithe. There are essentially three Firstborn Tithes. The Firstborn donkey, which is unique as it's a non-kosher animal, which has its value redeemed into a sheep or a goat, which is then given as a tithe to a Kohen. Then there's a regular Firstborn of a kosher animal, which is brought to the temple as the Bechor offering. Lastly, there's the Firstborn human, whose value is redeemed onto 5 Shalaim coins, which are then gifted to a Kohen. Chapter 1 will begin discussion on the laws of the Firstborn donkey tithes. The first Mishnah says, if somebody buys the firstborn fetus of a non-Jewish man's donkey, or he sells his own donkey's firstborn fetus to a non-Jewish man, or somebody enters a partnership with a non-Jewish man to own a donkey, or somebody who's taking care of a non-Jewish man's donkey, or somebody who has a non-Jewish man take care of his donkey, in all of these cases, there's exemption from the firstborn donkey tithe, as the verse states, all firstborn in Israel, meaning this only applies to animals owned by a Jewish person. The Gemara spends some time explaining the necessity for each of these cases to be listed. It states buying a donkey's fetus as he's bringing it to future sanctity there, but when he sells such a fetus, even though he removes it from future sanctity, he would still be exempt. The case of a partnership is mentioned, as there's a unique opinion that says one would be liable for the tithe there, which we're rejecting. And then we teach guarding, and therefore also having one's donkey guarded, to show one's exempt even though the Jewish man still fully owns the donkey. There was a discussion in the earlier Tractate Avodah Zarah on prohibitions against selling large livestock to non-Jewish people out of concern that it could be then used on Shabbos. So it unsuccessfully attempts to prove from our case that selling an animal fetus would not be problematic, as it could just not be discussing the opinion that would take issue with this. It attempts this from other quoted cases, and in the end it states that according to one opinion, it would be prohibited to sell an animal fetus to a non-Jewish person, as mentioned, out of concern that it'll grow and be used on Shabbos, similar to issues with selling a maimed animal, which could be healed. There's variation on how this is derived. Anyways, regarding selling the rights to an animal's future fetus, this is questioned, as according to those that say typically selling an animal fetus would be prohibited. On the one hand, this could be prohibited as it's similar to selling a healthy animal, but on the other hand, it should be permitted as the actual animal isn't being sold. And according to those that say selling animal fetuses would be fine, you could also say either way by the same reverse logic. So that's a disputed point, although it stands largely unresolved. Anyways, we said due to issues of violating Shabbos, it's prohibited to sell a large animal to a non-Jewish person. There's a penalty imposed on somebody who does this. Some say by 10 times the animal's value, some say 100 times, which is said to possibly be literal. We said earlier that by an animal owned jointly between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish man, the Mishnah said that there's an exemption from the Bechor tithe there, but a differing opinion maintained that in such a case he would still be liable. This is based on the interpretation of a verse. As for the opinion which said he'd be exempt from the tithe, this would possibly be either if the non-Jewish man owned a portion of the animal that if removed would make the animal improperly slaughtered, or possibly it's a portion that if removed would make the animal have a defect. This dispute is based on whether an animal with a defect can live or not. This is different from the case of a stillborn animal, as that has no unconsecrated portion mixed in, unlike here, where there is an unconsecrated portion by the portion owned by the non-Jewish man. It quotes some related cases of incidents like this, and it mentions some particularly invalidating defects, such as if the eyes are different sizes, which is a mutation. But if they're both very large or very small, that just means that the animal is a bit robust or frail. Some related incidents are quoted. New Mishnah, Kohanim and Leviim are exempt from the Bechor tithe, as if they were able to exempt the Jewish people from this in the wilderness, they should be able to exempt themselves. The Gemara clarifies, some say what it means is that the Kohanim and Leviim's animals exempted everybody's animals in the wilderness, so their animals now should remove sanctity from their firstborn animals. However, others interpret it that we mean that the actual Kohanim and Leviim firstborns, the people themselves, are exempt from the Bechor redemption, as if the Leviim in the desert removed the sanctity of the male firstborn animals, they should not be able to remove their own firstborn sanctity. This principle is sourced at length. It mentions in the wilderness, everybody's firstborn donkeys were redeemed with a Levi's Sela coin, which it then sources, although it's said to have covered many different animals per coin. It brings support for this point. In fact, there's actually just a broader dispute as to whether firstborn animals and people have this firstborn redemption requirement if they were born during the actual journeying in the wilderness. It discusses this from a number of verses. Some actually just adjust the dispute to be as to whether the Bechoros were sanctified initially, and then that kept going throughout the journeying in the wilderness, while others say they were actually sanctified only by the initial census, but that was it, with no further. Others hold like the original interpretation, but with the opinions reversed. Related, it said that a Roman minister asked about the fact that the census in scripture for the amount of Leviim is 22,300, and then in the later total count it only says 22,000, so why were 300 removed? It's explained that those 300 were firstborns, as they couldn't redeem other firstborns, as they could just remove their own sanctity. It also comments on a discussion on the measurements of the building of the tabernacle, as seemingly there's some discrepancy with the amounts used, which are explained that they had different sized measurements compared to what they had in those later times, as the temple mana measure was double the common one. Anyways, back to the firstborn donkey tithe. It's explained that this applies specifically to donkeys and not horses or camels, as it's based on scriptural decree, and also that as the Jewish people were leaving Egypt, they had all their valuables carried out on donkeys. Verses are quoted on this. New Mishnah. If a cow gave birth to an animal that looks like a donkey, or a donkey gave birth to an animal that looks like a horse, it's exempt from the firstborn tithe. Related by the laws of kosher. If a kosher animal gives birth to an animal that looks not kosher, it's still kosher, while if a non-kosher animal gives birth to an animal that looks kosher, it's still forbidden. The Gemara additionally spends some time sourcing these principles. Related, if a cow gives birth to a firstborn that resembles a donkey, as on the one hand, the firstborn species is subject to a monetary tithe, while the mother species is subject to physical sanctity, while on the other hand, both species are subject to the Bechor tithe. And if you say they should be subject to the Bechor tithe, then what about a donkey whose firstborn resembles a horse, as the firstborn doesn't resemble an animal subject to the firstborn tithe, but it also looks like a non-kosher animal, so it should be similar to the mother as a donkey? And if you hold, like, the latter opinion, what about a cow that gave birth to an animal that looks like a horse, as this is a not kosher animal, so it should go by the mother, but the mother here is subject to the firstborn tithe, while the firstborn species is not. So these cases are all disputed. We said by a kosher or non-kosher animal, if they give birth to something that looks like a differing species, it accords entirely by the species of the mother. That's sourced. It's additionally discussed, and additionally for the prohibition against drinking milk from a camel, as milk from non-kosher animals aren't allowed, in spite of the fact that it's a novelty anyways that we're allowed to drink milk in general from kosher animals, as it's technically formed from blood, which is forbidden, or it's technically similar to consuming the limb of a living animal if somebody drinks milk. It further sources the fact that kosher animal milk is uniquely allowed to be consumed. Anyways, it said if an animal bore a firstborn of an entirely different species, it'd only have the firstborn Bechor tithe apply if it still partially looked like its mother. Some require the head and greater part of the body to resemble the mother. In fact, it's disputed as to if that requirement would also apply by laws of kosher in regards to a mutant-born animal. There's variation on this. In the end, it sufficiently proves that for this opinion, even for consumption by laws of kosher, for it to be allowed to be eaten, its head and most of its body must resemble the mother. We said the product of non-kosher animals is forbidden. It asks, what about donkey urine, which is murky and vaguely looks like milk, and it's simply stated elsewhere that fluids from non-kosher animals are not kosher. Some say it's prohibited, but the reason it's even being discussed is as it apparently uniquely had medicinal benefits. Also, another exception to excretion from non-kosher animals is bee honey, which is actually kosher, which it sources. It also discusses other animal excretions that aren't kosher, like certain egg-like secretions from deer. It's said a donkey placenta could possibly be kosher, as it doesn't count as the donkey's body. New Mishnah. If a non-kosher fish swallowed a kosher fish, the kosher fish can still be eaten. If a kosher fish swallowed a non-kosher fish, the non-kosher fish cannot be eaten. This is as the respective interior fish didn't grow inside the other, like the prior case where it was based on what the mother was. Here, it was just swallowed. The Gemara says, this implies this is only the case if we actually saw the fish swallow the other. So it asks, why can't we assume that the non-kosher fish swallowed a kosher fish, then digested it, and then gave birth itself to a kosher fish? So there are a few answers, either that this fish was found in the intestines, or it was found in the throat, or it was found fully developed, or it's simply we say as majority of fish give birth to their own species. We can viably assume that the different species in the fish's stomach was swallowed, not born. Anyways, a related discussion on the breeding habits of various animals. Non-kosher fish are said to give birth to live young. Kosher fish lay eggs. All animals that give birth to live animals nurse with milk. All animals that lay eggs gather food for hatchlings, besides for the bat, which uniquely lays eggs and nurses. It's also said that dolphins uniquely reproduce in a similar manner to humans. Although, one of the commentaries, Rashi, defines the Aramaic word for dolphin here as a half-human, half-fish hybrid. So, a mermaid, essentially, although he uses the word for siren, and it's actually saying that humans can interbreed with them, but that's a related point. Anyways, all male animals who have external genitals have live young, while males with internal genitals lay eggs. Also, animals that have relations by day give birth at night, and animals that have relations by night give birth at night, and animals that have relations at any time give birth at any time, and this is relevant by some laws of finding eggs on a holiday, as to if somebody is not sure as to when the egg was laid, as discussed back at the very beginning of Tractate Bea. Also, all animals whose reproduction manner and gestation length are similar can interbreed with one another. All animals copulate facing the same direction besides for fish, humans, and snakes. who copulate facing each other, as they alone were addressed by the divine presence, the fish by Jonah, and the snake by the Garden of Eden. Some say camels copulate back to back. Anyways, it then gives the exact gestation lengths of various animals, and also corresponding trees or plants that have similar gestation periods. Like a chicken hatches after 21 days, which is similar to the almond. A dog is born after 50 days, which is similar to the fig. The cat after 52 days, like the mulberry. The pig after 60 days, like the apple tree. Foxes and some reptiles take 6 months, like grain. There are many other examples. One of these is particularly spoken on, the snake, which gestates for 7 years and has no plant equivalent, although some say it's a specific species of fig that's sourced. Anyways, it sets a dispute between the sage Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania and one of the Roman Caesars on the gestation period of snakes. The sage said it's 7 years. The Caesar said the wise men of Athens reported that snakes gestate for 3 years. So the sage responded, well, perhaps they had been pregnant for 4 years beforehand. So it essentially turned into a debate as to if the sages are wiser than the Athenians. So Rabbi Yeshua requested a ship be built with 60 cabins and 60 seats inside of each cabin, and he then took this and sailed to Athens. Rabbi Yeshua there saw a butcher skinning an animal, and he requested the head for sale, so the butcher agreed to the sale, but then the sage said no, he was referring to the butcher's actual head, which he'd claim unless he was shown to the entrance of the discussion hall of the wise men of Athens. So the butcher said he didn't want to, as they'd kill anybody who gave away their secret location, so the sage told him to just carry some reeds around and stop and rest around their entrance. So the sage found the secret entrance, and he saw there were some guards on the inside and on the outside, and he found that the policy was that they would execute the sentries if unauthorized footprints were found between them. So the sage waited for a moment, and then quickly placed his shoes down facing both directions, and in that way all of the sentries were killed and he managed to sneak in. So he saw there were 2 chambers, the upper one with the younger members and the lower chamber with the older members, and so as to not offend either group by greeting the others first, he just generally greeted everybody. So they asked what he was doing there, so Rabbi Yeshua said that he was one of the Jewish sages and he wished to learn of their wisdom. So they challenged him to a debate, with the terms being that if he won, the Athenians would have to join him on his ship. So they then asked him a series of riddles. These are all very esoteric in nature, and they're explained and interpreted by the commentaries to be debating some theological concepts on man's relationship with God. For instance, the first question was, if a man asks to marry a woman and the family refuses him, why would he then try to marry somebody of higher social status? So Rabbi Yeshua responded by sticking a pin into a wall, and he found he was unsuccessful, so then he stuck the pin higher up, where it entered a hole into the wall. So then it's explained to be basically a dispute on the Jewish people, who do not do very well in this world, but he explained it's a poor match and they will be successful in the world to come. Another question, if a man lent money and then he had to foreclose, why would he then lend again? So Rabbi Yeshua answered with a parable. A man went to a marsh and cut a bundle of reeds, but he couldn't lift them, but nevertheless he kept cutting more and more reeds, waiting for another man to come and help him. This is explained to be a question as to how, if the Jewish people were unsuccessful in keeping biblical law, why would they then try to keep extra rabbinic law later? And the sage answered by saying, just because one generation failed doesn't mean future generations can't do better. Another question, they asked for him to make a totally untrue statement, and he said a male mule gave birth, and the foal emerged with a note saying the mule was owed 100,000 zuz coins. So they asked, but mules are sterile? And he said, yeah, it's supposed to be an untrue statement. And this is a statement that's untrue in every possible respect, and it's also explained to be a very complicated allegory for the fact that the Jewish people will one day return together to Israel with Mashiach's coming. Another question, if salt goes bad, how can it be preserved? And the sage said, in afterbirth of a male mule. So they asked, but male mules can't have afterbirth? And he said, well, salt can't go bad. They asked him to build a house that floated in the air, so he said the name of God, and he flew in the air, and then asked for the necessary materials. Then they asked where the center of the world was, so he pointed to a random spot, saying essentially that the world is a sphere, so it has no specific center anywhere on its surface. Anyways, there are a bunch of other strange and esoteric questions, like how do you reap a field of knives? And he said with the horn of a donkey. They brought him 2 eggs and asked him which came from a black or a white hen, and he answered rhetorically with 2 cheeses, which came from a white or a black goat. And he was asked, when a chicken dies, how does its spirit leave its egg? And he answered the same way it got in. And lastly, he was asked to show an item that could decline in value more than its total worth. So he brought in a mat that was too wide to fit through the doorway, and it required the doorway to be broken down to be brought into the room. Again, there's a lot of commentary behind the esoteric meaning behind these conversations and what they were actually discussing. So, as the sage answered all the questions, he brought them all onto his ship, and he put each one in their own room filled with 60 chairs, so that way each man thought everybody would be coming to their room and entered with confidence. The sage also took some Athenian soil, And then, as they were traveling in the ship, he took water from a special location that absorbs all of the other waters in the ocean. Some say it's the Well of Miriam. Anyways, the sage brought all of the Athenian scholars to the Caesar, and he gave them their dirt so that way they could regain their confidence. However, they wound up offending the emperor, so the sage took the special infinite water and put it into a barrel and told the Athenians to fill the barrel with water. So they did so, but the water kept getting absorbed, so the Athenians kept working until they all grew exhausted and died. One commentary explains this is a metaphor for them to be unable to predict the precise nature of the Jewish calendar, as it operates simultaneously on the solar and lunar cycle, and this is all just metaphor for them failing at a nearly impossible task. New Mishnah. If somebody has a female donkey that hasn't given birth before, and it gives birth to twin male donkeys, only one lamb should be redeemed and given to the Kohen. If it had a male and a female, and he doesn't know which was first, a lamb is set aside, but doesn't need to be given to the Kohen. If somebody had 2 donkeys and they birthed 2 male firstborns, 2 lambs are given to a Kohen. If the donkeys had a male and a female, or 2 males and a female, 1 lamb is given to the Kohen. If they bore 2 females and a male, or 2 males and 2 females, nothing is given to the Kohen. If there were 2 donkeys and one had already given birth before, and they had 2 males, 1 lamb is given to the Kohen. If they had a male and a female, 1 lamb is separated and kept by the person. The redemption for the donkey is done with a lamb, as the verse states here. The redemption animal could be a sheep or a goat, it could be male or female, old or young, blemished or unblemished, it could be reused and redeemed on several donkeys. It's subject to the animal tithe, and if this lamb dies, it can still be benefited from. The Gemara says, by the case where the donkey gives birth to 2 males, this possibly disagrees with the opinion that it's possible to be precise with measurements and timings, or it's that we do agree with him, it's just an exception based on a verse. There's no matter of the 2 of the donkey's heads exiting at the exact same instant, as they can both still be sanctified, so we clearly don't think things could happen at the precise same time. The reason why one of the donkey fetuses is sanctified in spite of there being an interposition from the other twin fetus is as it's on the same type, so it doesn't cause an interposition. We said if the donkey bore a male and a female, a lamb should be separated and can be kept. This apparently must be done to allow the donkey to be used again, which means that the one who stated this holds that until a lamb has been redeemed, the firstborn donkey cannot be benefited from. Others dispute this, which is discussed further. It's largely a debate if this animal can be benefited from based on some verses. Some say that similar to the Egla Arofa, if the donkey is beheaded instead of being redeemed, it's agreed it cannot be benefited from. It also debates as to whether this donkey meat would be subject to food impurity, as it's not really typically viewed as a food. It additionally discusses these points, and further disputes as to whether a decapitated calf can be benefited from. It does rule, according to the opinion, that a firstborn donkey could be redeemed with a lamb worth any amount, even one worth as little as a sixth of a zuz, even if the lamb is very thin. Although it is ruled, the donkey should be redeemed with a lamb worth 3 zuzim, which is what's recommended. Also, this redemption of the firstborn donkey, according to some, doesn't even need to be done with a lamb. It could be done with some other items. Some redeemed it with cooked vegetables, for example. Some say it's effective to redeem somebody else's donkey for them, and the owner would still keep the donkey. We said that the redemption lamb of a firstborn donkey is still subject to being tithed. The only way this could really be possible is as it'd have to be without the Kohen receiving the lamb. So it would be if there were something like 10 questionable firstborn donkeys, so there's 10 sheep redeemed for them, so he can keep 9 and give the last one as the tithe. It's had some similar cases by various tithing laws. There's some further discussion on these principles. Anyways, we said if the redeemed lamb for the donkey firstborn tithe dies, it could still be benefited from. The necessity of stating this is to say that the moment the lamb is redeemed, the Kohen has ownership of it, meaning if it dies, the Kohen can benefit from it. New Mishnah. Some animals that cannot be used to redeem the firstborn donkey: a calf, any wild animal like a deer, a slaughtered animal, an animal with a defect, any hybrid goat and sheep, or a hybrid goat and deer. Some say the hybrid goat and sheep would be allowed, as they fit the described classification, but not the part deer animal, as that has a doubtful status. Also, if an owner gave the actual unredeemed firstborn donkey to the Kohen cannot keep it unless he actually redeems it onto a lamb. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles. Also, according to the opinion that the slaughter of an animal covers the fetus, it asks if an animal's fetus can be redeemed for a donkey, as on the one hand, it's just like meat, but on the other hand, it's alive. That's disputed between several opinions. Also, if an animal's parents are one species, but the child just physically looks like a different species, like 2 goats give birth to a goat that just looks a lot like a sheep, according to the opinion that a hybrid wouldn't be allowed, it asks if this would be, as if there's a difference, so that's disputed from several cases. It also asks on the legitimacy of redeeming a firstborn donkey onto disqualified sacrificial offerings, according to those that say the donkey cannot be benefited from, as if this prohibition will then transfer to the other animal. It said it would be prohibited, as that's similar to redeeming the donkey onto a deer or similar. Also, it's asked about redeeming a firstborn donkey onto sabbatical year animals, specifically by a firstborn donkey of questionable status. that still must be redeemed. Some say this would be allowed by the questionable firstborn donkey. It's also said that a sabbatical year animal itself is exempt from this Bechor tithe, and also is subject to the Kohanic gift tithes as mentioned in chapters 10 and 11 of Tractate Chulin. It's been some time sourcing these principles. The reason a donkey can't just be given straight to a Kohen without him redeeming it first is as we don't trust that they'll redeem it themselves, even if they're specifically trustworthy individuals. New Mishnah. If somebody designates a lamb to redeem a firstborn donkey and it dies before being given to the Kohen, Rabbi Eliezer says the owner must replace it, as it's similar to the firstborn son redemption tithe, while the sages say the owner doesn't need to replace it, as it's similar to the Ma'aser Sheni redemption, that it does not need to be replaced in the event that it's lost. Others confirm the latter opinion, which says that it doesn't need to be replaced. If the actual firstborn donkey dies, Rabbi Eliezer says it has to be buried and the lamb could be benefited from. The sages say it doesn't need to be buried and the lamb belongs to the Kohen. The Gemara additionally discusses the sources for these opinions. It is said that the donkey firstborn is redeemed from birth, but another source says it's redeemed after 30 days. Some explain this to mean that if it's redeemed before 30 days, it's redeemed after the fact, while others explain it to mean it just needs to be redeemed within 30 days, although it confirms the former opinion. New Mishnah. If somebody doesn't want to redeem the firstborn donkey, it must be decapitated from behind, as stated in this verse, although redemption would take precedence over decapitation of this animal. Similarly, the marriage of a maidservant to her master takes precedence over the decapitation of this animal, which is based on verses, and the Levirate marriage, Yibum, is preferable to the rejection of the Levirate marriage, Chalitza, but then in later generations, when people stopped doing this just for the mitzvah, it became preferable to do Chalitza. Lastly, the mitzvah of redeeming an animal must be done by the owner, and he takes precedence over every other person based on a verse. And that's the end of chapter 1 of Tractate Bechoros.